Greetings to you from Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum in Decorah, Iowa. I am Dale Goodman, and I'm about to tell you the story of the beginnings of Norwegian immigration to the United States, beginning in 1825. More specifically, I'm going to tell you about a group known as the Sloopers, the first organized group of Norwegians who traveled to the U.S. in that year. I grew up with this story because very much it is my family's story. Directly, it is my family's story. And my family was one of the 6 families that sailed on the Restauration, the first Norwegian immigrant boat from Norway in 1825. Norwegians began immigrating to the U.S. as in great numbers in 1825, and that continued until 1943. And in that time, over 800,000 Norwegians immigrated to the U.S. That's about 42% of the population of the country. Most immigrants from Norway immigrated for economic reasons. Nearly 2/3 of Norway is rocky hillsides and bare mountains, and most of the remaining third is forest and bogs and ice. But only about 3% is tillable land. And 95% of the population was trying to live off the land. So most people came for economic reasons, but the primary reason for the immigration of the Sloopers was religious freedom. But the religious freedom aspect begins with the Constitution of Norway. The 1814 Constitution of Norway, which we celebrate on 17. Mai. The very beginning of the Constitution, which is about the form of government and religion, Article 1 simply says that the Kingdom of Norway is a free and independent and indivisible realm, and it's a hereditary monarchy. But it's Article 2 that's important in this story, that the evangelical religion shall be maintained and constitute the established church of the kingdom. And the inhabitants who profess that religion are bound to educate their children in the same way. But there's 2 other parts that existed in the Constitution from 1814 to about 1851. One is pointed at Roman Catholics. The Jesuits and monastic orders shall not be tolerated. That was clearly pointed at Roman Catholics. But furthermore, Jews are totally excluded from the Kingdom of Norway. The state church of Norway is the Lutheran Church of Norway, and everyone is Lutheran, and everyone participates in the rites of the church, including baptism, confirmation, marriage, Holy Communion, and burial rites. There are no religious assemblies outside of the authority of the state church. One of the people who objected to the state church was Hans Nilsen Hauge. He was a reformer of the church. He believed in the participation of women. He probably had beat modern Lutheran churches by 200 years in terms of having a female preacher. He also encouraged the participation of youth. He was also, in addition to being a church reformer, he was also an economic reformer, and he's actually credited with bringing the Industrial Revolution to Norway. But while he has been celebrated as economic reformer and for what he did with respect to the Industrial Revolution, he was imprisoned 14 times because of his unacceptable behavior in the Lutheran Church, and having, heaven forbid, religious meetings outside of the state church. Another factor in what was happening with respect to religion in Norway was the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon was powerful on land, but England ruled the sea. Denmark, or I should say Norway, was under Denmark and was allied with France, and therefore Norway and Denmark were both enemies of England. And as boats crossed the North Sea, England could capture them, and they took them to England and put the prisoners on what was known as prison ships. The prisoners on the prison ships were attended by Quakers. In the midst of a war, many prisoners were attracted to the Quaker religion of peace. And at the end of the war in 1814, about 30 Norwegians returned to Norway and were anxious to practice Quaker principles. One of them was Lars Larsen Hjælane, and he lived in Stavanger, and he had been captured going across the North Sea and had been in a prison ship in England for 7 years. After the war was over in 1814, he elected to stay in England for a couple of reasons: to learn more about the Quaker religion and to learn English. But in 1816, just 2 years later, he returned to Norway, and he held the first Quaker meeting in his home in 1816. And that, of course, was against the law. I think it's important to say that this is not just church law, to remind you that it is constitutional law. It's violating the Norwegian Constitution when you have a religious meeting in your home. So now there are two dissenting religions, the Haugean Lutherans and the Quakers. There were a number of attempts made locally. Both religions were centered around Stavanger, and there was a lot of attempts to change the laws in that area to permit other religions, to permit worship in a different way. But those laws didn't pass. The persecution of both groups continued, with fines for things they did or didn't do, and even what I would call religious atrocities. Among them, the sheriff would go out in the country and literally kidnap children to take them in to be baptized. One of the worst, however, is a family that had two daughters, twin daughters, and they both died. And they asked for permission to bury them in the church graveyard, and that permission was denied, and so they buried them on their own land. And when the authorities found out, they were required to exhume their dead daughters and rebury them according to the rites of the church. And they were fined heavily until they actually did that. There was communication with the Quakers in England. They were well aware of what was going on with the Quakers in particular, not so much the Haugean Lutherans, but what was going on with the Quakers in Norway. And a couple Quakers came up and talked to the group around Stavanger and encouraged them to consider immigration to the United States. They told them that the Constitution of the United States promises freedom of religion. Since both the Haugean Lutherans and the Quakers were experiencing the same thing, they got together and they raised funds to send some scouts to the United States to explore the possibility of immigration.